The Legend of Zelda, a magnificent story, right? It spans 18 games, with extremely intricate lore and references throughout all of them. The writers have really put a lot of work into planning this out and keeping things straight, right? It's not like they're just making things up as they go, and that the dots we've connected for them were really just them looking out, right? Okay guys, I think it's time for us to have an uncomfortable conversation about our favorite series. I'm Cornelius Belmont, and let's talk about writer's due diligence. Let me start off by saying, if it wasn't obvious by the thumbnail and intro, that this episode is going to be a bit more about the meta nature of the series. We are talking about the writers of the series, and how different teams have had their input into games over the years. Most importantly, though, is that I'm going to talk about the responsibility of those writers to do their homework on the series, and I'm afraid to say that work ethic is sadly lacking. Now I really want to clear something up, which is that Eiichi Aonuma usually takes the role of director or producer, which means strictly speaking he isn't the writer of the series. He is, however, the head of the project, with approval of the writing of the game going through him, and as such I will be using him as a figurehead in my statements here. Mr. Aonuma, I love your work, but there are some problems we need to talk about. I realize it's not easy to keep things straight over so many entries in the series, but there are a lot of fundamental problems that simply get messed up over so many critical titles. It's honestly really frustrating as a fan of these games, and as a theorist who has questions that never seem to be a high priority for the developers to answer. They raise some really interesting topics in the games, but those topics are just left floating, never to be answered. Allow me to give you a few examples from my past episodes. In A Link Between Worlds, we learn about the Kingdom of Lorule in a parallel dimension, and that they too had a Triforce. The virtues that compose it, however, were different from those we see in Hyrule. We are left to speculate what those virtues may have been, but it is only at best teased at the end of the game as to what that answer might be. It's such an interesting topic, and yet it is likely never to be touched on again in canon. At least with the Lorule story, it is completely self-contained to A Link Between Worlds. When things start to spill over into other games, the problem gets way worse. For example, the connection between the mainstream entries are likely the most messy sections where things occur. Now, just to be clear, I love each of these games, but there are contradictions that don't make sense, leaving us to have to make huge leaps of logic in order to make sense of it. Clearly, going into detail about each and every little thing causing conflict would be near impossible to do in a single video, and so I've decided to focus on the big five that Aonuma has played a role in, and has ultimately become the foundation of the Zelda story going forward. Those titles are Ocarina of Time, The Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword, and Breath of the Wild. Again, I'm going to be focusing on the problems with continuity between them, which becomes abundantly clear with debates over Breath of the Wild's timeline placement. Let's start with the one that really launched things into a new era, Ocarina of Time. It was pretty revolutionary. Aonuma was still pretty new to video games at the time, and mainly worked as a dungeon designer on this one. He wouldn't be given a director or producer role until major titles such as The Wind Waker, though he was the producer of Four Swords, which may have been a test to see how well he would do. With him not actually being in charge of Ocarina, the contradictions and inconsistencies presented in a time travel story I am not holding against him, but there are big issues left unresolved in this game. One of which that I've already talked about in my past video are how the Gerudo people are left unresolved, as well as exactly how far back Link was sent into his childhood. Had Ocarina of Time been completely standalone, I think the final scene with Link and Zelda in the garden would have been just fine, and assumptions could have been made that Ganondorf would have been taken care of, and effectively all problems could have been solved. Majora's Mask coming out a year later dashes some of this, but we could perhaps pretend that the knowledge that Link shared with Zelda, that any lingering problems could have been fixed by the royal family. Twilight Princess, however, causes some problems, but we will get there. Next up is the Wind Waker, and again, had Wind Waker been standalone, it would have resolved everything well. Aonuma was the director here, and he seemed to be paying pretty close attention to the story currently crafted. The game itself looks like it was intended to wrap up a lot of loose ends, so that way he could move forward with making new stories without the baggage of Hyrule. It honestly was a pretty smart thing to do, and Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, which followed, subsequently don't muddy the waters at all. It is unfortunate that going forward there was a huge backlash to the art style of The Wind Waker, and that backlash caused fans to demand a more real-looking Zelda, as well as a focus on the events of Ocarina of Time. This, along with pressures from Nintendo, due to the performance of the game, eventually won out and put the rest of the adult timeline on hold. It is worth noting that one of the really big things The Wind Waker cemented is that there was in fact a chronological order to the games, something that had been speculated by fans for a very long time. This of course led to the development of Twilight Princess, which is where some of the writing starts to cause problems. On a surface level, things seem fine until you analyze the unification of the Triforce, and the conflict that has with the Wind Waker. If you watched my previous episode about Link's desertion from Hyrule, you are aware that there is an innate contradiction as to the state of the Triforce at the end of Ocarina of Time. To summarize, when Link was sent back to his younger state, pulling him back into the child timeline, the existence of the hero was removed from the adult timeline. He was, however, in possession of the Triforce of Courage at that point, and so upon his removal, that Triforce ended up breaking into 8 pieces in order to remain in that world. Link then appeared in the child timeline before the events of his adventure, meaning Ganondorf had not yet touched the Triforce, causing it to split. Thus the Triforce was in a unified state. Yet in the past events of Twilight Princess, they imply very much that the Triforce is in a separated state, with a piece appearing on Ganondorf's hand during his execution. You can also clearly see a piece on Link throughout the game, notably during the sumo match section where he is stripped to the waist. This is a pretty big conflict, and perhaps there is a reason behind why the writers specifically decided upon this, but that is not made clear to us the players, which ultimately comes off as bad writing. Simply put, this should have been explained clearly and not left up to our interpretation. On a side note, virtually any time writers say, "up to your interpretation," that is usually a cop-out for, "we didn't think this through," and is something that we see a lot of when talking about Breath of the Wild. Still, this little mishap with the Triforce involving time travel is something I'd say could be understandable, considering that stories involving time travel are notoriously bad at staying consistent. The problem with the Temple of Time presented in Twilight Princess, on the other hand, is less forgivable. Again, if you've watched my previous episode, you are likely aware of how the connections between Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess have glaring problems, specifically around the midpoint of the game involving the Temple of Time. Instead of being in Castletown as we saw in Ocarina, it is now in the Faron Woods located in a place called the Sacred Grove. The temple itself is in ruins, something I wouldn't expect to see from stone architecture for multiple hundreds of years. And yet only about 100 years has passed since Ocarina. The function of the Master Sword, entering the Sacred Realm, and maybe the Temple of Light, are also contrary to what we are told and experience in the events of Ocarina of Time. To my knowledge, Aonuma has never given an explanation as to the changes of the temple, and I cringe to think about the phrase player interpretation popping back up. Making things worse is that a certain amount of inaccuracy, while never a good thing, can be expected between entries in a series spanning 19 games. That being said, Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess are 2 of the biggest and most mainstream games in the series. If we look at the work Aonuma put into the Wind Waker, it is a nearly flawless execution of lore connecting to Ocarina of Time. Maybe it is related to him not really wanting to continue the Zelda series in the direction of Twilight to begin with. Next up, we look at the events of Skyward Sword. This one doesn't really cause any problems with the timeline, and actually does what Aonuma intended very well, which was to flesh out the past of the series. The only inconsistency I have with it would be at the very end of the game concerning the placement of the Master Sword. That is something I am planning a video based around, so I'm not going to go into those details right now. Let's just say that due to time travel at the end of the game, there is a plot hole which really should have been thought through more clearly, especially if this game was created specifically to wrap up problems going forward in the timeline. That one issue in Skyward Sword out of the way, the rest of the lore that it set up is actually pretty good. The next Zelda game of note in my opinion is A Link Between Worlds. I know I said I would be focusing on the main 5 games, but I just wanted to mention that this game goes out of its way to include things talked about in the main series, notably things about Triforce holders, and that cool Triforce overlay hand mechanic. I really feel like the creators of this game really cared about the timeline, which is better than I can say about some of the more notorious entries out there. So then we come to the big one, Breath of the Wild. Oh boy, where do I start? To try and run down all the inconsistencies, especially when it comes to names, imagery, and locations, is simply not possible to do inside of a single video. What I do really want to talk about, though, is an attempt to hand-wave away any responsibility of doing research into making Breath of the Wild timeline compatible. This is actually the root of why this video is being made. Breath of the Wild takes place 12,000 or more years beyond any previous point in the series. It is so far into the future that all previous tales are supposed to be myth and legend. At the same time, they include clear references to previous games in the series, such as an outright statement to the hero of Twilight, referencing how Ganon once took the form of a Gerudo man, referencing Ruta as a sage, a reference to the Great Sea, and some others, just to name a few. This strikes me as extremely careless and lazy, because the writers are trying to get all the bonus points for referencing past games, without doing any of the research to make sure there are no conflicts. When the fans make a big fuss about it, they then double down on the idea that it is so far out into the future, all while fundamentally ignoring that direct references to very specific events happen. The worst part for me is if they had just been a little bit more careful, they could have avoided this entire mess to begin with. And like my previous statements, this ultimately falls on Aonuma, as he is the producer of Breath of the Wild. There are plenty, and I mean plenty of fans out there, who would help them keep this timeline stuff straight if they bothered to reach out. And even if they felt they shouldn't reach out to fans for whatever reason, I expect Aonuma to have some master plan designed for how this will all work out. I do want to say that a lot of the external frustration for me personally is that I keep seeing this type of soft reboot attempt in franchises that I like, and yet somehow Breath of the Wild, possibly the best Zelda game to date, does it so incredibly badly. Now, it is possible that Breath of the Wild 2 will clean up all of these issues. I do honestly believe that there are going to be a lot of fundamental unanswered questions involving Breath of the Wild as well as Age of Calamity that is going to directly link to the events following Twilight Princess. Part of me also wonders if there will be a solid attempt by Breath of the Wild 2 to try and end the main story completely. So, writer's due diligence, let's talk about that. Pretty much it boils down to the idea that the writer for a topic has an innate responsibility to pay attention to the source material in order to prevent conflict and contradictions. Most of the main series games that I've talked about here are decent or great at not causing problems, but a lot of that ends up relying on being overly vague, or simply not addressing the consequences that would come about due to the events of the game. I'd say that up to the entry of Breath of the Wild, the writers of at least the main series had done their due diligence. The main series, of course, being the 5 games I listed earlier. However, Breath of the Wild drops this ball pretty hard, and tries to excuse itself with an extremely long time skip, followed up by a refusal from Aonuma himself in interviews refusing to answer any questions involving timeline placement. I really hope that this is sorted out and has a satisfactory resolution with Breath of the Wild 2. Because if they blatantly ignore this problem again, there are going to be a lot of upset fans. It's possible though that Nintendo simply doesn't care since Zelda will move units regardless. After all, they only seem to create a main entry into the series to push new technology and systems. What would hurt most for me is if Aonuma himself would seemingly not care enough about us dedicated fans to fix this, especially with all the hype behind Breath of the Wild 2. I fear that such an action on his part might cause the series to go into remission. Let's summarize. It is the duty of a writer to research previous entries into a series to avoid conflicts in the narrative. Throughout the main series of games, that being Ocarina of Time, The Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and Skyward Sword, a genuine effort seems to have been made to link the games together without conflict. When Breath of the Wild came out, that work ethic seems to have been completely ignored, and instead opts to move the time frame so far out into the future that they can handwave away any inconsistency and restrictions of the past lore. Simply put, that is bad writing. But depending on how Breath of the Wild 2 plays out, it could be fixed. In order to truly fix such a problem, a clear placement in the timeline would need to be cemented, preferably with major events presented in the main story and not hidden behind side quests and vague dialogue. This whole situation reeks of a soft reboot attempt, something that we keep seeing in other media, and much like in those, it is failing to actually prevent inconsistencies, as aspects of the original work continue to exist in the new rebooted canon. At the end of the day, it is up to Eiichi Aonuma to make sure that Breath of the Wild 2 is written well and addresses these issues, because if it fails to, there are going to be a lot of hurt fans out there, with yet another disappointment being thrown on the pile for the more hardcore fans. It will seem likely that Nintendo, and in this case Aonuma himself, doesn't really care about that aspect of their fanbase, possibly due to the realization that there are enough fans not invested in the lore that the series will remain profitable even if these plot holes remain. As negative as that might sound, I have a feeling that Aonuma really cares where this is headed. The Legend of Zelda series at this point is his life's work, and I believe that he is setting up Breath of the Wild 2 to be his most crowning achievement. Thank you guys for watching the episode. This is a new channel and it will need all the support it can get, so please like and subscribe to help it grow. Going forward, my channel may not be focused entirely on Zelda theories, but considering it is one of my favorite franchises, it's likely to get a lot of the spotlight. In them, I tackle some interesting theories that I've never seen other YouTubers talk about. Feel free to leave your comments below regarding the video, and I will make sure to try to answer them. I welcome all feedback, though I request you keep it constructive. Thanks again for watching. This is Cornelius Belmont signing off.